A clash of worlds. Maya Johnson's car rolled down the dimly lit suburban street, her fingers lightly drumming on the steering wheel. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt offered her a brief reprieve after a long week. She was coming off a grueling series of meetings and a high-stakes operation that had tested her team's mettle. Her duties as a captain in the city's police department came with constant demands, but Maya had never been one to shy away from responsibility. The flickering neon sign of a gas station caught her attention. Her dashboard warned that her fuel gauge was dangerously low. With a resigned sigh, she turned into the station, parking beside one of the pumps. Maya stepped out of her car, the crisp night air brushing against her uniform. The familiar scent of gasoline filled her nose as she began filling up her tank. Her mind wandered to the weekend ahead, hoping to find some peace and maybe catch up on the book gathering dust on her nightstand. Meanwhile, Officer Jake Carter patrolled a nearby street. His night had been uneventful, a sequence of mundane tasks that further deepened his sense of dissatisfaction. Carter was a man consumed by resentment, a feeling that had grown with each passing year in his stagnant career. He saw himself as a victim of unfair circumstances, watching others ascend the ranks while he remained stuck in place. Promotions were out of reach, and recognition was something he only dreamed of. His marriage was another sore point, teetering on the edge of collapse. Carter often sought solace in the prejudices he'd absorbed from his father, a retired cop who had painted the world in stark contrasts of us versus them. Tonight, as his cruiser turned a corner, the headlights illuminated a figure at the gas station. It was a black woman in uniform, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the station's lights. Carter's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Something about the scene triggered an instinctual unease in him. A woman like her, black, confident, and in uniform, did not fit within the narrative Carter had built in his mind. He slowed his vehicle, his internal monologue kicking into high gear. What's a black woman doing out here alone at this hour? Especially in uniform, he thought, suspicion intertwining with the latent biases he had harbored for years. In the stillness of the night, the low growl of Carter's cruiser grew louder as he pulled into the station. Maya glanced up, momentarily blinded by the glare of the patrol car's headlights. She recognized the vehicle as a colleague's but thought little of it. She had been a police officer long enough to know how to navigate impromptu encounters with her own. As Carter stepped out of his car, Maya instinctively sized him up. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with a tense gait that betrayed frustration. His expression was sharp and unfriendly, his eyes scanning her as though she were a suspect under investigation. She remained calm, accustomed to managing difficult situations with grace. "Evening," Carter said curtly, his tone devoid of warmth. He approached her with measured steps, his hand resting on the belt that held his holstered weapon. "Good evening, officer," Maya replied evenly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew her place in the world. "What brings you here at this hour?" Carter's question was clipped, almost accusatory. Maya raised an eyebrow. "Just filling up my tank," she replied, motioning toward the gas pump. "Is there a problem?" Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her car, the gas station, and then back at her. He couldn't pinpoint anything explicitly wrong, but his prejudices filled in the blanks. In his mind, this was an opportunity to assert his authority, to reestablish control in a life where he felt powerless. "ID and registration," Carter demanded abruptly. Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. She had been through enough unwarranted stops to recognize this for what it was. Still, she chose to comply for the sake of de-escalation. "Of course," she said, moving toward her car to retrieve her credentials. Carter watched her every move, his posture stiff. When she handed over her ID, he glanced at it without truly processing what he was seeing. Instead, his mind lingered on the fact that she was black and in a uniform, a combination that his biases found difficult to reconcile. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked again, his tone sharper now. Maya's patience wavered. "As I said, officer, I'm filling up my tank. Is there something specific you're looking for?" "You seem out of place," Carter replied, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Late at night, in a uniform. Seems unusual." Maya straightened, her composure steady but her resolve firm. "I could say the same about you, officer," she countered, her tone calm but pointed. "I didn't realize being a police officer required an explanation to another officer." Carter's face tightened, the power dynamic shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. His insecurities flared, prompting him to push further. "I'll be the one asking questions," he snapped. "Step aside from the car." Maya sighed inwardly, realizing this was no longer about protocol, but about Carter's need to assert dominance. Her years in the force had taught her to pick her battles, but this wasn't one she could walk away from. She stepped back, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of compliance. As Carter began inspecting her car, his actions became increasingly invasive. He opened the trunk without permission, rummaging through her belongings under the guise of a routine check. Maya stood by silently, her expression unreadable, though her mind was racing. She was acutely aware of the power dynamics at play and the thin line she was walking. "What exactly are you looking for, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. "Anything out of the ordinary," Carter replied tersely, not meeting her gaze. Maya's patience finally wore thin. "Perhaps you should take another look at my ID," she suggested, her tone firm. Carter frowned, pulling the ID from his pocket. This time, he looked at it more closely. The name Captain Maya Johnson leaped off the card, accompanied by her rank and badge number. His heart sank. He felt a cold sweat break out as realization dawned. This wasn't just another black woman he could intimidate. This was one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. Maya watched as his face turned pale, the shift in his demeanor almost comical. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Carter's mind raced, struggling to reconcile his actions with the gravity of his mistake. "Captain Johnson," he finally stammered, the words catching in his throat. "Yes," Maya replied, her voice calm but unyielding. "And I think we need to have a conversation about your approach tonight." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, the full extent of his prejudice laid bare. For the first time in years, Carter felt something unfamiliar: shame. The weight of choices, the silence between Captain Maya Johnson and Officer Jake Carter stretched unbearably long, broken only by the hum of the gas station's lights. Carter stood rooted to the spot, his face betraying the conflict brewing within him. He had always relied on the authority of his badge to shield him from scrutiny, but tonight that shield felt like a fragile veneer, cracking under the gaze of someone who saw through him completely. Maya, on the other hand, maintained a composed exterior. Years of facing bias and prejudice had taught her to remain calm, even in moments of blatant disrespect. But beneath her calm, a storm of emotions churned. This wasn't the first time she had been subjected to unwarranted scrutiny, and she doubted it would be the last. Yet the fact that this encounter came from within her own department stung in a way that outside prejudice never could. "Officer Carter," Maya said, her tone even but resolute, "do you understand what you've done here tonight?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but no coherent words came out. He felt as if the weight of her question pressed directly against his chest, threatening to crush the very air from his lungs. He shifted uncomfortably, finally managing to stammer, I was just doing my job, ma'am." "Doing your job," Maya repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut through his fragile excuse. She took a step closer, her presence suddenly commanding. "Let's break that down. Your job is to protect and serve, correct? So tell me, how does stopping a fellow officer without cause, conducting an unwarranted search, and treating me as a suspect serve anyone?" Carter's face reddened, the shame and anger bubbling inside him, now mixing with a desperate need to justify himself. "It's not like that, Captain," he muttered defensively. "I didn't know it was you." Maya raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying this would have been acceptable if I weren't a captain? Or is the problem that you didn't expect someone of my rank to look like me? Her words were deliberate, hitting him like a series of blows designed to peel back the layers of his fragile worldview. Carter's breath hitched. He wanted to protest, to explain that it wasn't about race. But deep down, he knew the truth. His biases had guided his actions, not any legitimate concern for safety or protocol. He had let his frustrations and prejudices cloud his judgment, and now he stood exposed. "I made a mistake," Carter finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya studied him for a moment, her piercing gaze searching for sincerity in his words. She had seen this kind of remorse before, fleeting, performative, and driven more by embarrassment than genuine regret. But something about Carter's posture, the way his shoulders slumped and his eyes avoided hers, suggested there was more beneath the surface. "A mistake," Maya repeated, her tone softer but no less firm. "Officer Carter, mistakes are when you spill coffee on your report or misfile paperwork. What you did tonight goes far beyond a mistake. It's a symptom of a deeper problem, one that doesn't just affect you, but every person you're sworn to protect." Carter flinched at her words, the truth hitting harder than he anticipated. He felt like a child being scolded, but there was no denying the validity of her critique. He had let his anger and resentment drive his actions, turning his badge into a weapon instead of a symbol of justice. Maya continued, her voice now tinged with a quiet intensity. "Do you know how many times I've been stopped like this in my own city? How many times I've had to explain myself, prove my legitimacy, just because someone couldn't see past the color of my skin? And do you know what makes this worse, Officer Carter?" She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You and I are supposed to be on the same side." Carter swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't mean for it to come across that way," he said weakly, though even he didn't believe his own words. "No," Maya said firmly. "You didn't mean to get caught. There's a difference." The harsh reality of her statement settled over him like a dark cloud. For years, he had justified his actions with the belief that he was maintaining order, doing what needed to be done in a chaotic world. But tonight, faced with someone who had spent her entire career embodying the ideals he claimed to uphold, he couldn't ignore the glaring hypocrisy of his behavior. Maya took a deep breath, her expression softening just enough to convey that she wasn't here to destroy him, but to make him understand. "Tell me, Officer Carter," she said, her tone measured. "What led you to this moment? Why did you feel the need to assert yourself like this, without cause or reason?" Carter hesitated. He had spent so long burying his frustrations and deflecting blame onto others that the idea of confronting his own shortcomings felt foreign. But something about Maya's presence, her unwavering commitment to justice, even in the face of his prejudice, compelled him to speak. I don't know," he began, his voice shaky. "I've been in this job for almost 10 years, and it feels like I'm going nowhere. Everyone else is moving up, getting recognition, and I'm just stuck. And it's not fair. I've worked hard, done everything I was supposed to, but nothing seems to change." Maya listened intently, her expression unreadable. She had heard similar stories before, but she knew this wasn't just about career stagnation. There was more beneath the surface, a deeper wound that Carter had yet to acknowledge. "And you think that justifies what you did tonight?" she asked gently. "No," Carter admitted, his voice barely audible. "I know it doesn't, but sometimes I just feel so angry. Angry at the system, angry at myself, and I don't know how to deal with it. So I take it out on the wrong people." Maya nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "That anger you feel, that's real. I won't dismiss it, but how you choose to handle it defines the kind of officer, the kind of person you are. Tonight, you let it control you, and because of that you failed, not just me, but yourself, and everyone who looks to you for protection." Carter's head dropped, the full weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long blaming others for his unhappiness that he had never stopped to consider his own role in his misery. Now, faced with the undeniable consequences of his actions, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: accountability. Maya stepped closer, her tone softening but still firm. Change doesn't happen overnight, Officer Carter. But it starts with acknowledging the truth. If you're willing to confront that truth, to face the parts of yourself you've been running from, there's a chance for redemption. But if you keep letting your anger and prejudice dictate your actions, you'll destroy yourself and hurt a lot of people along the way. Carter looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and determination. "I want to change," he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice undeniable. "I don't want to be this person anymore." Maya regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "Then prove it," she said simply. "Not to me, but to yourself, and to every person who relies on you to do the right thing." As she turned to leave, Carter called out to her, his voice trembling. "Captain Johnson." "I'm sorry." Maya paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Apologies are a start, Officer Carter, but actions speak louder than words. Remember that." With that, she got into her car and drove away, leaving Carter standing alone in the gas station lot. The weight of the night hung heavy in the air, but for the first time in years, Carter felt a spark of hope. Change wouldn't be easy, but perhaps with enough effort, he could become the officer he had once aspired to be, and the man he had always wanted to become. The mirror within. Jake Carter drove through the silent streets, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. The conversation with Captain Maya Johnson replayed in his mind on an endless loop, each of her words cutting deeper than the last. He could still feel the intensity of her gaze, the unwavering conviction in her voice. She had exposed him, peeled back the layers of his excuses, and forced him to confront a reality he had long denied. As he parked his patrol car outside the precinct, Carter sat in the driver's seat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The fluorescent glow of the streetlights above cast long shadows across his face, mirroring the storm brewing within him. He couldn't go inside just yet, not like this. He needed time to think, to make sense of the emotions that threatened to consume him. Stepping out of the car, Carter leaned against the hood, staring out at the quiet street. The city felt different tonight, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. He thought about his father, a man whose words had shaped so much of his worldview. "Never trust people of color," his father had often said, his voice laced with disdain. Those words had been Carter's foundation growing up, a lens through which he viewed the world. But now, those beliefs felt like shackles, holding him back from the person he wanted to be. For the first time, Carter allowed himself to question everything he had been taught. What if his father had been wrong? What if the world wasn't as black and white as he had been led to believe? The memory of his father loomed large in Carter's mind. A decorated officer who had once been revered within the department, his father had always portrayed himself as a pillar of justice. But behind closed doors, his prejudices were as blatant as the framed medals on the wall. As a child, Carter had idolized him, absorbing his lessons without question. Yet now, those lessons felt like poison, seeping into every aspect of his life. Carter thought back to his career, the moments that had brought him to this point. He had joined the force with dreams of making a difference, of being someone his community could rely on. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had been overshadowed by frustration and bitterness. Every missed promotion, every perceived slight, had driven him further into the darkness. And tonight, that darkness had nearly consumed him. He glanced at his reflection in the car window, barely recognizing the man staring back. His uniform felt heavy, not with the weight of duty, but with the burden of his failures. Carter closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. The next morning, Carter sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to chase away the heaviness in his chest. His wife, Emily, sat across from him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You've been quiet all morning," Emily said, her voice gentle. "What's going on?" Carter hesitated, unsure where to begin. He and Emily had drifted apart over the years, their once loving relationship now strained under the weight of his frustrations. But today, he felt an overwhelming need to confide in her, to share the thoughts that had been plaguing him since the encounter with Captain Johnson. "I made a mistake last night," Carter admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "A big one." Emily set her coffee cup down, her eyes fixed on him. "What happened?" He recounted the events at the gas station, sparing no detail. He told her about the assumptions he had made, the unwarranted stop, and the realization that he had targeted a high-ranking officer solely because of his biases. As he spoke, the words felt like a confession, each one lifting a small piece of the weight from his shoulders. When he finished, Emily leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Jake," she began carefully, "it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of anger. But this isn't who you are. At least it's not who you used to be." Carter looked down at his hands, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted. "I've been so consumed by everything. Work, my failures, the pressure to live up to expectations. Somewhere along the way, I lost myself." Emily reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "Maybe it's time to find yourself again," she said softly. "You don't have to keep living like this. You can change." Her words echoed Maya's from the night before, and for the first time, Carter felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't be easy, but perhaps it was possible. Perhaps he could rebuild himself, piece by piece. Later that day, Carter found himself at the precinct, standing outside Captain Johnson's office. He had debated whether to approach her, unsure if she would even be willing to talk to him. But he knew he couldn't move forward without addressing what had happened. Taking a deep breath, Carter knocked on the door. A voice from inside called out, "Come in." Maya looked up from her desk as he entered, her expression neutral. "Officer Carter," she said, her tone even. "What can I do for you?" Carter hesitated, feeling the weight of her gaze. I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice shaky. "Not just for last night, but for everything. For the way I've been acting, for the assumptions I've made. You were right. I let my anger and prejudice get the better of me, and I realize now how wrong that was." Maya leaned back in her chair, studying him. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the genuine remorse etched into his features. "What do you plan to do about it?" she asked, her tone measured. "I want to change," Carter said firmly. "I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to let my anger control me, or let my prejudices define who I am. But I don't know where to start." Maya considered his words, her expression softening slightly. "Change starts with accountability," she said. "It means confronting the beliefs and behaviors that brought you to this point, and actively working to unlearn them. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if you're serious about this, there are resources and people who can help." Carter nodded, the sincerity in his eyes unmistakable. "I am serious. I just need a chance." Maya offered him a small, encouraging smile. "The fact that you're here, taking responsibility, is a step in the right direction. But words are only the beginning, Officer Carter. It's your actions that will determine who you become." As Carter left her office, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he was ready to face himself, the good, the bad, and everything in between. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, he knew it was a journey worth taking. Turning the tide. For the next several weeks, Officer Jake Carter embarked on a journey he had never anticipated. Change, he quickly realized, was far more challenging than he had imagined. His encounter with Captain Maya Johnson had shaken him to his core, and though he wanted to be better, the process of confronting his biases and insecurities was deeply uncomfortable. Carter's first step was to accept Maya's offer to attend a department-sponsored workshop on cultural awareness and implicit bias. He had initially balked at the idea, his pride urging him to dismiss it as unnecessary. But deep down, he knew it was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. He walked into the precinct's training room on a sunny Saturday morning, uncertain and self-conscious. The room was filled with officers of varying ranks, many of whom Carter recognized. He spotted Maya near the front, her calm and confident demeanor instantly making the room feel smaller. She wasn't leading the session, but her presence was a reminder of the stakes. The workshop began with an exercise. Each officer was handed a blank sheet of paper and asked to write down their first thoughts when presented with a series of images. A group of teenagers loitering outside a store, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, a young man wearing a hoodie, and a black woman in a police uniform. Carter felt his stomach churn as he completed the task. The exercise forced him to confront the snap judgments he made daily, judgments he had long justified as gut instinct, but now recognized as deeply flawed. When the group reconvened to discuss their answers, Carter listened intently, his discomfort growing with every story shared. Officers spoke openly about their own biases, their struggles to overcome them, and the impact those biases had on the communities they served. When it was Carter's turn to speak, he hesitated. His throat felt dry, and his heart raced as all eyes turned to him. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "I never thought of myself as someone who had biases. I grew up hearing things from my father, and I guess I just absorbed them. But over time, I let those beliefs shape how I see the world, and that's not the kind of officer I want to be." The room was silent for a moment, and Carter braced himself for judgment. But instead, he saw nods of understanding. Maya, sitting in the corner, gave him a small, encouraging smile. For the first time, Carter felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of real change within the department. Outside the precinct, Carter began to take intentional steps to rebuild his relationships with the community. He requested to be assigned to a community outreach program, a role that required him to interact directly with residents in underserved neighborhoods. At first, he felt like an outsider, his uniform a visible barrier between him and the people he was tasked with serving. One of his first assignments was to participate in a youth mentorship program at a local community center. Carter walked into the brightly painted building with a mixture of apprehension and determination. The room was filled with kids of all ages, their laughter and chatter filling the air. As Carter introduced himself to the program coordinator, a woman named Diane, he couldn't help but notice the wary glances some of the kids gave him. "They're not used to seeing officers here," Diane explained gently. "Most of their interactions with the police haven't been positive." Carter nodded, a pang of guilt twisting in his chest. He had been part of the problem, and now it was up to him to make amends. Over the next few weeks, Carter dedicated himself to building trust with the kids. He showed up consistently, participating in their activities, listening to their stories, and sharing his own experiences. Slowly but surely, the walls began to come down. The kids started to see him not just as an officer, but as a person. One afternoon, as Carter helped a group of teens assemble a new basketball hoop, a boy named Marcus pulled him aside. Marcus was 16, with a quick wit and a guarded demeanor that reminded Carter of himself at that age. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, his tone hesitant. "Of course," Carter replied. "Why do you care?" Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you here? Cops don't usually care about kids like us." The question caught Carter off guard, but he answered honestly. "Because I've made mistakes," he said, "and I want to make things right. I can't change the past, but I can change how I act now. And I want you to know that there are people out there who care about you, even if it doesn't always feel that way." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said simply, though Carter could see the flicker of trust beginning to form. Meanwhile, Maya watched Carter's progress from a distance. She had been skeptical of his initial apology, wary that it might be driven more by guilt than a genuine desire to change. But as weeks turned into months, she saw a transformation in him that was impossible to ignore. During a routine department meeting, Maya approached Carter as he packed up his notes. "How's the mentorship program going?" she asked casually. Carter looked up, surprised by her question. It's challenging, he admitted, but it's also rewarding. I feel like I'm actually making a difference, even if it's small. Maya nodded, a hint of a smile on her lips. Small changes lead to big ones, she said. Keep at it. Carter hesitated before speaking. Captain Johnson, he said, his tone serious. I want to thank you for calling me out that night and for not giving up on me. I don't think I would have gotten to this point without you. Maya's smile widened, though her eyes remained steady. The real work came from you, Officer Carter, she said. You chose to confront yourself, and that's not easy. But remember, this is just the beginning. Change is a lifelong process. As she walked away, Carter felt a renewed sense of purpose. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. He was no longer the man he had been that night at the gas station, and though he couldn't undo the harm he had caused, he was determined to spend the rest of his career and his life building something better. Bridges across divides. Jake Carter stood on the precinct steps, the cool morning air brushing against his face. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine sense of purpose, a commitment not to the badge on his chest, but to the ideals it represented. The changes he had begun to make within himself were small but significant, and though the path ahead was long, he knew it was worth walking. But change, he realized, could not happen in isolation. It wasn't enough for him to confront his own biases. The department itself needed to be a part of the transformation. He had seen firsthand how systemic issues and entrenched attitudes could create a culture of exclusion and mistrust, and he was determined to do his part to challenge that culture. The first step was to open a dialogue, a task that seemed almost insurmountable in a profession where vulnerability was often seen as weakness. Carter decided to start with his fellow officers, many of whom had shared his frustrations and prejudices, though they were often left unspoken. Building a bridge within the department, Carter approached his precinct's commander, Lieutenant Briggs, with a proposal. I think we need to have regular discussions about community relations, he said. Not just training sessions, but real conversations where we can address the issues we're facing head-on. Briggs raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You think a few talks are going to solve anything? He asked. No, Carter admitted, but it's a start. Look, I know I've been part of the problem. I've made mistakes, and I'm not proud of them. But I've learned that pretending those mistakes don't exist only makes things worse. If we want to rebuild trust, with the community and with each other, we have to be willing to face those mistakes. Briggs leaned back in his chair, considering Carter's words. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said. But you're organizing it. And if this turns into a shouting match, it's on you. Carter left the office feeling both nervous and hopeful. He knew the meetings wouldn't be easy, but he also knew they were necessary. Over the next few weeks, he worked tirelessly to set up the first session, enlisting the help of Maya and a few other officers who shared his vision. The first meeting took place in the precinct's small conference room. About a dozen officers showed up, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Maya sat near the front, her presence both reassuring and commanding. Carter stood at the front of the room, his palms sweaty as he addressed the group. Thank you for coming, he began. I know this isn't the kind of thing we usually do, but I think it's important. We've all seen how the relationship between the police and the community has deteriorated. And whether we like it or not, we're part of that. Tonight, I want us to start talking about how we can be better, not just as officers, but as people. The room was silent for a moment, and Carter feared he had lost them. But then a veteran officer named Rodriguez spoke up. I'll be honest, he said. When I first heard about this meeting, I thought it was a waste of time. But listening to you now, maybe you're right. We've all got things we need to work on. The conversation that followed was raw and uncomfortable at times, but it was also honest. Officers shared their experiences, their frustrations, and their fears. Maya spoke about her own journey, the challenges she had faced as a black woman in law enforcement, and the resilience it had taken to rise above them. Her words resonated deeply, challenging the room to see beyond their own perspectives. By the end of the night, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the room. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step forward. Reaching out to the community. While the department began its internal transformation, Carter focused on strengthening ties with the community. The mentorship program at the community center became a cornerstone of his efforts, but he also sought out new ways to engage with residents. One afternoon, Carter joined a group of volunteers working on a neighborhood cleanup project. As he picked up trash along the sidewalks, he noticed a woman watching him from her porch. She was elderly, with a sharp gaze that seemed to cut through him. "You're new around here," she said as he approached. Carter nodded. "I've been here a few months," he replied, "trying to get to know the community." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. We need more of that." Her tone was firm but not unkind. "Too many officers come through here acting like they own the place. You want to make a difference. Start by listening." Her words stayed with Carter, and he made it a point to listen more. He attended community meetings, spoke with local leaders, and took the time to hear residents' concerns. It wasn't always easy. Many people were wary of him, their trust eroded by years of negative experiences with law enforcement. But slowly, he began to earn their respect. A pivotal moment. One evening, Carter was called to respond to a dispute at a local convenience store. When he arrived, he found two teenagers arguing with the store's owner, a middle-aged man who appeared agitated. "They were trying to steal," the owner said, pointing at the teens. "That's not true," one of the boys protested. "We just didn't have enough money for everything, so we were going to put some stuff back." Carter could see the tension escalating. In the past, he might have reacted differently, focused solely on maintaining control. But now he approached the situation with a calmer demeanor. "All right, let's take a step back," he said, his voice steady. He spoke with the teens and the owner separately, gathering both sides of the story. It became clear that the boys hadn't intended to steal. They were simply short on cash and embarrassed to admit it. Rather than escalating the situation, Carter reached into his pocket and paid for the items himself. "Next time, just ask for help," he told the boys gently. "There's no shame in that." The store owner, initially resistant, softened as he watched Carter handle the situation. "Thanks, officer," he said, his tone more conciliatory. "I guess I overreacted." As Carter walked back to his car, one of the teens called out, "Thanks, man. You're not like the others." The words struck a chord in Carter. He knew he wasn't perfect, but moments like these reminded him why the work was worth it. The ripple effect. By the end of the year, the changes within the department and the community were beginning to show. The dialogue sessions at the precinct became a regular occurrence, with more officers participating each time. Community members started to see the department not as an enemy, but as a partner. Maya watched Carter's transformation with quiet pride. He had gone from a man driven by anger and prejudice to someone who actively sought to make a difference. It wasn't just his actions that had changed. It was his entire approach to life. One day, as the precinct celebrated the success of a new community police partnership, Maya approached Carter. "You've come a long way, Officer Carter," she said. "But remember, the work is never done." Carter nodded, a small smile on his face. "I know it," he said, "and I'm ready for it." As the celebration continued, Carter looked out at the room. A mix of officers and community members, laughing and talking together. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging. Change was possible, and though it required effort, vulnerability, and persistence, it was worth every step. The legacy of justice. The precinct buzzed with activity as Carter sat at his desk, reviewing notes from the latest community outreach meeting. It had been over a year since that pivotal night at the gas station, and while the memories of his encounter with Captain Maya Johnson still lingered, they now served as a powerful reminder of how far he had come. The man he was today bore little resemblance to the one who had acted on prejudice and frustration. Change had not been easy, but it had been worth every painful step. Maya had been instrumental in his transformation, not as a savior, but as a catalyst. She had pushed him to confront his flaws and given him the tools to rebuild himself. Now, as she prepared to transition to a higher position at the state level, Carter found himself reflecting on her influence and the legacy she would leave behind. Maya's farewell and a new challenge. The precinct gathered in the main hall that afternoon to bid farewell to Captain Johnson. Officers of all ranks, community leaders, and even local residents filled the space, their respect for her evident in their smiles and applause. Maya stood at the podium, her uniform crisp and her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "When I first joined this department," she began, "I never imagined I would one day stand here as a captain. The journey hasn't been easy. There were moments when I questioned whether the fight was worth it. But looking at all of you today, officers, community members, allies, I know that it was." Her gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on Carter. "The work we do is not just about enforcing laws. It's about building trust, breaking down barriers, and creating a system that serves everyone, not just a select few. My time here has been one of the greatest honors of my life, and I leave knowing that this department is in good hands." As the room erupted in applause, Carter felt a swell of emotion. Maya had set a standard that was both inspiring and intimidating, but he was determined to carry her legacy forward. The new role. In the weeks following Maya's departure, Carter was approached by Lieutenant Briggs with a surprising offer. "The community outreach program has grown a lot under your watch," Briggs said. "We need someone to lead it officially, to take it to the next level. I think you're the right person for the job." Carter was stunned. A year ago, he had been a man struggling to find his place, consumed by bitterness and self-doubt. Now he was being asked to lead a program that symbolized everything he had come to believe in. "I'm honored," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do my best to live up to the trust you're placing in me." The new role came with its challenges. Carter found himself mediating between officers resistant to change and community members still wary of law enforcement. But he approached every obstacle with patience and humility, leaning on the lessons he had learned from Maya and his own experiences. One of his first initiatives was to expand the mentorship program at the community center. He worked with local leaders to create workshops, job training opportunities, and mental health resources for young people. The program became a beacon of hope for the community, drawing attention from neighboring precincts and even the media. A meeting with Maya. Months into his new role, Carter received an unexpected call from Maya. She was back in town for a conference and wanted to meet. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the precinct, a casual setting that belied the gravity of their conversation. When Carter walked in, he saw Maya sitting by the window, her presence as commanding as ever. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Officer Carter," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Or should I say Director Carter now?" Carter chuckled, feeling a sense of pride at her words. "I wouldn't be here without you, Captain." Maya tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "You give me too much credit. The changes you've made, the person you've become, that was all you. I just held up a mirror." They talked for hours, sharing updates and reflecting on the progress the department had made. Maya was particularly interested in the community outreach program and the impact it was having. "This is exactly what we envisioned," she said. "A department that works with the community, not against it. Keep pushing, Jake. The work is never done." Before they parted, Maya placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've proven something important," she said, "that people can change. And when they do, they can inspire change in others. Never underestimate the power of that." A crisis and a defining moment. Not long after their meeting, Carter faced one of the most challenging moments of his career. A controversial officer-involved incident had occurred in a neighboring precinct, igniting protests across the city. Mistrust of law enforcement reached a boiling point, and tensions threatened to spill over into violence. As a leader in the community outreach program, Carter was thrust into the middle of the crisis. He attended town hall meetings, listening to the anger and pain of residents who felt betrayed by the very people sworn to protect them. He met with officers, urging them to approach the situation with empathy and transparency. One night, during a particularly heated protest, Carter found himself face to face with a young man holding a sign that read, "Justice for all, not just for some." The man's voice was filled with emotion as he yelled, "How can we trust you? How can we believe anything will change?" Carter stepped forward, his own voice steady but filled with conviction. "Because I changed," he said. "I used to be part of the problem. I let my anger and my ignorance guide my actions, and I hurt people because of it. But I saw the harm I was causing, and I chose to do better. I can't promise that change will happen overnight, but I can promise that I'm committed to making it happen, and I need your help to do it." The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We'll hold you to that," he said. A new chapter. As the crisis subsided, Carter reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The man he had been, the man who had stopped Maya Johnson that fateful night, felt like a distant memory. But he knew he could never forget that version of himself, because it was a reminder of how far he had come. Under his leadership, the community outreach program continued to grow, becoming a model for other precincts across the state. Maya's legacy lived on, not just in Carter's work, but in the countless lives she had touched during her career. One evening, as Carter walked through the neighborhood, he saw Marcus, the young man he had mentored at the community center. Marcus was now a college student, studying criminal justice with dreams of becoming an officer. "I want to make a difference," Marcus told him. "Just like you did." Carter smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You will," he said. "Just remember, change starts with accountability, and it never stops." As the sun set over the city, Carter felt a profound sense of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road worth traveling. For Maya, for the community, and for himself, he was determined to keep building a legacy of justice and trust. This concludes the unique 6-part story. If you'd like further refinements or additional sections, let me know.